Good afternoon. I'm Mark Allen with Gaper.io, and I'm here today with Lawrese Brown, the founder of Ctrack. Good afternoon, Lawrese.
Good afternoon, Mark. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. So can we start with a brief background of yourself and your work experience?
Yes. So even more important than my work experience, what I will start is my background in education, and that will help you understand why Ctrack exists and why it does what it does. So I've always been and prided myself on being a really good student. And so that meant I was valedictorian in 8th grade. I did well in high school. I went to boarding school. I graduated magna cum laude from college. And again, I had a high GPA when I even got my master's. And that's important because Ctrack exists because I realized I did well in school, but I was not prepared for the workplace. And my first jobs, again, they were typical jobs, right? Like it was the job where you get in, you're doing, I believe I did digital ads in the era of like SEO, you know, where you tried to help people customize it a little bit, but it was to get the brand name out there. And then my second job focused more on marketing from the perspective of how do I build meaningful partnerships online? Like, hey, can you make this LinkedIn announcement? That kind of thing. But the job that got me more into education was actually at a nonprofit. And that's important to note because that's when the gear started turning and saying, okay, you know what, there's other ways that we teach people, other methods, fellowships, certifications that we can educate people beyond school.
Very interesting. And I think, maybe we'll talk about this more later, but I think education in general is about to go through, I don't want to say a renaissance, but it's going to change after this, our current situation.
Yes, and as it should. You know, one of the reasons, so when I started Ctrack in 2014, the mission was always, you know, what do we need to be successful in school? Or excuse me, what do we need to be successful in the workplace? So I went to schools, I went to high schools, I went to colleges, I went to nonprofits that focused on teaching those skills. And after about 4 years, and I had some successes, right? I built 2 curriculums, one for a high school advanced manufacturing program, which most people don't even think of career and technical education anymore as a pathway. I worked with a community college, which we know that 40% of undergrads go to, but we don't often think of them when we think of college, on creating a first-year seminar that focused on, hey, these are the skills and these are the pathways. And really, when I exited education, or exited, I would say, colleges and universities, there wasn't any incentive to innovate career development. What reason is there, right? Like there's no, and so I'm excited that this is happening now, specifically for post-secondary, because you know, the question becomes bigger. Well, how does doing this prepare me for work, not only skills level, but also with a workplace that's increasingly becoming remote, right? A workplace that also is increasingly qualitative, or, you know, even remote work calls for a visual type of learning. So I hope that post-secondary institutions, after they navigate what is it like for people maybe not to be on campus, can ask themselves how to update a curriculum that reflects the new expectations of work.
Yeah, that would be very nice. So what has been your experience with remote employment in general?
I serve my clients remotely. And when I have worked with organizations, specifically startups, they have remote employees. And even knowing that we were having this conversation, it made me think of for people who haven't worked remotely, think of if your office has a satellite office or a satellite campus, right? Because the same thing comes up in the sense startups will do offsites or they'll do team building. And the question is always, how do we keep people connected? And when you start talking about communication, people who are on a satellite office, so if your company is in Manhattan, but you have an office in Brooklyn, one of the things people will note is, you know, we feel less connected, right? We feel a little secondary because we feel like when we have a question, it's not answered as immediately. And then that causes a bottleneck. So my work is primarily remote and moving more remotely in terms of course development and building a community. But also I'm familiar with working with teams who are navigating remote workers.
Very interesting. So, and what do you think is the future of remote employment? And what do you think needs to be done differently to make it more effective?
So I read this book called The Leadership Challenge, and I forget the author. But what was important about that is And when we go to the workplace, people are focused on power, and they broke power down in a role in two ways. Power is both your discretion. You know, that's why CEOs, you can't tell the CEO what to do, right? But the higher you go up, the more discretion or flexibility you have in how you do what you do. What they found is that the second element of workplace power is visibility. So that's really why often remote work, you would hear people say, I don't feel as connected to the team, or, you know, you would feel people say they felt they needed a different level of support, which is fair. And so I mentioned that to say, when we look at the way, you know, an increasingly remote workforce, we have to ask ourselves, one, I mean, we talked earlier off the podcast about self-management. How do I get things done? But if you're a manager, you have to ask yourself, you know, when you're asking people to complete tasks, is there what's the purpose? Meaning, when we talk about productivity, is it just pure, hey, task, like there's different variables that impact us at home? For example, now some people are homeschooling their children. So is it just like, listen, you're the input, I needed to get it done, like output, productivity? Or, you know, do we still hold people at home to the same standards we hold them to when they're in the office, which has more to do with accuracy, and meaning like how well, you know, this is how we need this done. How well have you done this according to that? And also we frequently hold people to, it leaves me, there's accuracy. Efficiency. How quickly can you do it? Right? So we hear these things coming up right now where people are being like, I feel like people are asking me to prove that I'm working from home. I feel like my manager is saying, how much, you know, can you get done? And these were things that weren't done at the office. So I think immediately what managers have to ask themselves is, what is my metric for success? Like, what standard, right? How do I manage an employee's performance in a new way that's less about, less about time, right? And that requires the second piece of it, which is more trust, which Google did a survey, or not a survey, an experiment called Project Aristotle, which found that, and Aristotle said the sum is greater than the parts, but they found 5 key areas that are important for strong teams. The first is psychological safety, which has to do with your ability to take risks, innovate. A risk is something even as subtle as disagreeing with someone on the team and still feeling like your status or your job is not questioned. But the second piece is dependability. And people, when I work with managers, I tell them to ask themselves, what do you need to trust that your direct report is going to get something done? Again, proximity, the visibility, the ability to see someone and tap them is so much of what we rely on, that you have to ask yourself now, well, what behavior do I need to see to know that once I give someone a task, that it's going to be done? So where previously it was like, you know, the person could, previously when I worked with companies, people would say things like, if something changes, I need you to talk to me immediately. And people would say, listen, that is contingent upon proximity. If I'm in a satellite office, how am I going to access you immediately when I need you? And we have to have plans around that now. You know, if someone needs an immediate answer, you're remote and for whatever reason, they're not able to give it to you. How do you either, one, give that person a plan to answer it, or just what is your plan around that, right? If you don't have an answer, what do people do, especially in a timely manner? I would also say people also have to realize that a lot of factors related to dependability are still there. So when I work with startups, for example, they'll say, well, you know I can trust you if you do what you say you're going to do. I don't believe anyone is at home having the dance parties that people believe that they're having. I believe people are still doing what they say they want to do. I also know what people will say about dependability is people want gut checks. So they say, listen, you know, dependability is honesty. If I go to Mark and I'm like, Mark, is this a good idea? And you're like, no, Lawrese, but here's what is good about it. So what I will say is we want to think more about establishing dependability, which is ultimately about trust, so that we don't become those micromanagers, and also think about engagement. That's a third piece, which I know people in HR right now are doing everything from, Kahoot games and like Zoom dance or Zoom happy hours. And you know, the best way to think of engagement is, one, how do you keep people feeling connected to the mission or their work so that they're doing more than just the minimum? There is no, that's different from every employee, but I do know that these are questions we have to have answers to for every employee now, not just the ones that have the option to go remote, which usually are people at a higher level. But how do we ask that question? You know, what projects engage you? How do we, or flip it on its head, because we know engagement is about how connected someone feels to the work and how much they understand the way their work impacts the organization. So how do we, when we give those directives, how do we say, hey, this is important, especially at this time, because it connects to this? So that creativity and that understanding of what drives specific employees is going to be increasingly important. And that was something people tend to look at with leadership, but now I think we're going to see that more as a conversation for all.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's been true, even the traditional company where everyone comes into the same office. That's been true since day one, those things you talk about. I think the current situation has really brought it to the forefront.
Yes, and communication styles. So the economists, they did a survey in 2018, and they found that honestly, the biggest factor in organizational inefficiency is people have different communication styles. And I would encourage everyone to look at that, because one, if you're a manager, and managers are so critical right now, but in general to organizations' long-term success, you need to know what your communication style is, because that's part of what makes you effective. And many of us believe that when we explain something, there's no reason people should have a question for us to clarify. You know, we're like, oh no, and it's like, but again, going back to psychological safety, are you in an environment where someone says like, hey, Mark, can you clarify? Most people actually don't do that. So I would encourage everyone to learn their communication style in two ways. So go to the Economist 2018 survey, figure out if you are intuitive, personal. Most people have a personal communication style. It's functional, and it's also analytical. I would also encourage you to look at the 5 personality types, because that'll help people see how you communicate in times of conflict. And by that, I mean, when you have to give feedback, which, you know, I can only imagine how those conversations will go remotely, but also when you have to deliver unfortunate news. You know, we heard, we were reading about, or I read about the startup that got everybody on a Zoom call, you know, that quick, they gave a quick message that was like, you're being let go. And that just, you know, yeah, that is, we're going to have to still have difficult conversations. And I would encourage people not to send them important information via email, because email loses tone and it loses that human connection that we're already feeling is scarce. So whether it's Zoom, I also encourage people to get out of Messenger for things like that, because it's easy to be misinterpreted. So for people to be more conscious of the other elements of communication that are human, which is the tone of your voice and people seeing you, you know, we have to bring those things back. But yeah, going back to the 5 personality types, there are people who are aggressive, there's accommodating, there's 2 more, but that leave me at the moment. But moral of the story is figure out how you communicate.
So yeah, fascinating. So what's the story behind Ctrack, and what's the journey been like?
The story behind Ctrack is most people will tell you that the reason why school doesn't work, most people who have that narrative are people who didn't do well in school and then went in the workplace and became successful entrepreneurial, which is excellent. And the reason why I'm a different voice is because, again, I did well in school and I still don't believe school serves anyone anymore for the workplace. So when I started focused on education, and what I realized, Mark, is most people now at work don't have communication skills, effective communication skills. They don't know what it's like to meaningfully work in a team beyond you do this and you do this and you do that. They don't know how to think together. And because we're so used to other people or taught in school that there's a right answer, when we get into creative and critical thinking, when people are asking questions about how to innovate and do things differently, we don't know how to do that. Well, you know, that's why there's an emphasis in school on project-based learning. So where that's taken me is, especially in the workplace, is training. It's taken me doing skill-based workshops. It is, my favorites though are working with startups on when they have their offsites. Because that's a rich opportunity where people are like, the beauty of a startup is people care about culture, which loses, that sentiment that startups have. Established organizations, nobody explicitly says it, but it loses a little bit of that, your humanity's not fair, but it loses a little bit of that, like every employee counts the bigger you get. So a great example of that is people at startups will say, you know, it's amazing. I was employee number 5 and now we're up to 55. Mm-hmm. And so just that understanding, watching that growth journey and watching people, you know, bringing other people on and investing, being invested in a startup's growth is awesome. But going back to Ctrack, well, my work has taken me in every modality that we develop humans. So that's training, coaching, consulting, and now we're moving more into courses.
Very interesting. So we talked about the pandemic, and it's really forced most of the world to go remote and in a very short amount of time. Have you noticed has it caused any major roadblocks or challenges for you or any of your customers?
I would say when I focused on, so I'm gonna start with me. I'm currently in the process of doing a management and leadership development program for an organization. That was quick. What we did is we moved everyone online. But I would say if you are someone who is used to, if you're a trainer and you're used to paper, like, you know, people going through step by step, here's the activity, which is the way I operated, then you're moved into visual learning, which actually is more effective for people than, you know, paper and word of mouth at times. So I would say, don't miss that in this pandemic. If you are an educator, you have the asset of visuals, which most people, it's easier to digest information. What I would say is more difficult, again, has to do with people not knowing how to, it all goes back to communication at this time. So it's, what's the best mode to communicate this? Like I'm gonna pull back. Mm-hmm. When organizations right now, even managers especially who I work with, think about the things they have to communicate. They have to communicate expectations for how a task should be done. They have to communicate concerns. They have to communicate decisions from the top down. They have to communicate feedback, right? And those things we rely on people being in person for. And so there's a little bit of uncertainty and discomfort with, well, how do I say this? And some people actually, they like that the workforce has gone increasingly remote, meaning it benefits their communication style, especially if you're someone who feels caught off guard at work frequently. Mm-hmm. So like, you know, Mark, those experiences where someone's like, hey, Mark, can you do this at 5 p.m.? And you're just like, sure. And then later on, you're like, I cannot do this at 5 p.m. Those people are at an advantage right now because someone is not tapping you on the shoulder and putting you on the spot. Someone's sending you an email so they can take a pause. But when you're having more difficult conversations like some clients are having, which is, you know, we have to let people go, that's, you know, you want to do that in a way that's respectful of people's contributions to an organization. And I've heard about people who have to do it, but I think people are still grappling with, again, how do I do that well? Like, yes, it's done, you know, like going back to the productivity, you know, efficiency, accuracy conversation, but do we have a standard for how we do those things well yet? Mm-hmm. You know, we don't. And that's what's coming up now. And even going back to schools, because, you know, we got to talk about education because that's the ethos of Ctrack. You know, when schools had to quickly move online, the first question was, well, how do we do this? It wasn't like, how do we do this well? It was just, you know, what is the core basic thing we need to do right now? And I would encourage every person to think about that before they start being down on themselves about other metrics. What is the fundamentals? What do we need to do right now before we start to measure our accuracy and, you know, our efficiency and other variables?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. So there are companies like Gaper that help develop, build, and scale products, especially for startups. How important do you think that's going to be in the future where these startups have to hire quality people and they have to hire them in a hurry? And I know you deal with a lot of startups, right?
Yes, and people who are coach clients who are leading startups, managers at startups. So you said, so scaling quickly, right?
Scaling quickly, yeah.
So what's been fascinating about this for anybody at a startup, from what I've gathered from my clients, is startups treat people like processes. And what does that mean? Think about how quick, it goes back to the concept of sharing your Legos, which I love. Shout out to Janice from Bravely, who introduced me to that. So the idea of sharing your Legos is as startups grow, there are decisions that maybe you made at one time that are no longer in your wheelhouse, right? Either because, you know, the team is shifting, or because there's someone, you are a manager, they're bringing in a VP, et cetera, right? There's some offshoring of your decision making. But we also know what happens at startups is, let's take onboarding, for example, where someone's like, listen, just sit next to this person and you're going to learn what you need to know. You can't do that now, right? You can't, and you're going to sit all day and flash your Zoom screen in front of someone. It's not effective. So what I would say a great advantage startups have, and what Gaper is offering, is the opportunity to create process earlier. Because so often when you're moving quick, you just count on that person to be there. You count on that person to stay later. You count on that person to say, okay, well, you know, it's in my head. But how do we get things like, again, the onboarding process? How do you take that from being so reliant on one person to being like, here's our process for this, and facilitate it differently? And that's meaningful right now because, you know, people have natural limitations. So that's one great advantage I see, is people recognizing, let's get that process down early. And again, it not being about a perfect process. Let's just, what is the process? And then we can iterate from there.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we do offer at Gaper is that coaching of how to do this, how to have remote employee. I personally have had, you know, people reporting to me on 4 different continents in my career.
Right.
You know, it's challenging at first, but after a while you get into a nice cadence, and it actually forces you to be more disciplined.
And Gaper's in 20 different countries right now, right? Yes. I mean, not Gaper, but yeah. So yeah, similar. And the same thing too is we get used to people who, again, the greatest assumption everyone has in the workplace is people do things like me. No. You know, so having that process also gets you out of that. It gets you asking the question. I tell managers, ask yourself, what has to be done universally, and where do people have autonomy to iterate? Because you'll hear managers and they'll be like, I don't want to delegate because people don't do it like me. It's like, they're not, they're not going to, and in many times they're not supposed to. Right. But where they need to, it's great that Gaper does that, because you give them process and procedure. And that's critical for times like this. Yes, it is. So, Lawrese, this has been fascinating. You have a wealth of knowledge on this topic. We could talk for hours, but we do. So I want to thank you for your time today. Yeah, well, Mark, thank you. You know, it's timely. You know, it's one of the things, Gaper and Ctrack are in the same place, which is you started early, and now we're all seeing, oh man, this is actually, it's urgent now. Yeah. Whereas before it was like, oh, we could wait. I remember telling someone about my work, you know, wanting to advance in education. And they were like, it's kind of like insurance. You know how you get insurance, but you never really hope you need it, right? Like, you know, you want to be prepared for remote work, but you're like, that's nice. Like, I hope, you know, we hope it doesn't come to that. Well, now, you know, tell them to cash in their insurance, you know, insurance policies with Gaper and Ctrack. So I appreciate your time today. Tell Emma, thank you. I will. And, you know, as people navigate this transition, remember to ask people, keep the human element first. Remember, it's not about efficiency and accuracy, productivity, input, output. How do we get it done? And then how do we iterate from there? Sounds good. Have a great day. You too. Bye. Bye. Hold on. I was like, no. I was like, do I actually?